The day the Duke of Ashenmore announced his new Duchess to the assembled lords and ladies of England's finest drawing rooms, he did not look at her once. Isolde stood beside him in the grand hall of Fenwick House, her ivory silk gown catching the candlelight, her chestnut hair pinned with a pearl comb that had belonged to her dead mother. 300 guests watched. 300 pairs of eyes moved from the Duke's stone-cold profile to the quiet woman at his side. And yet the Duke, Caspian Vale, the most powerful peer south of York, spoke to Lord Aldrich for 20 minutes straight without turning his head a single inch toward his new wife. The whispers began before the first course was served. She heard them like a slow tide coming in, word by word. She is nobody. He married her out of pity. He will break her within the month. Isolde kept her chin level. She did not reach for her wine. She did not flinch. She had heard worse in the weeks since the engagement was announced, and she had made herself a promise the night before the wedding, standing alone in her father's crumbling study with a single candle burning down to nothing. She would not break. Not for him. Not for any of them. The hall smelled of beeswax and winter roses. Footmen in ash-gray livery moved between tables like ghosts. Outside the tall windows, January pressed its frozen face against the glass. Isolde watched the snow fall in the gaps between curtains and thought of her father, Baron Ravenswood, bedridden in the east wing of their ruined estate in Suffolk, his lungs rattling with the damp that had crept into the walls the winter the roof gave way. She had married Caspian Vale to save that roof. To save the 42 tenant families who lived on Ravenswood land and had nowhere else to go. She had known from the first conversation that the Duke had no tenderness in him. He had sat across the walnut desk from her with his gray eyes cold as iron, laid out the terms of the marriage contract like a business arrangement, and told her plainly, "You will provide an heir. You will manage my household. You will attend whatever public engagements I require. Beyond that, I have no expectations of you." She had looked back at him steadily. "And beyond that," she had said, "I have no expectations of you either." Something in his expression had shifted then. Just for a moment. As though she had surprised him. Then it was gone. Now, seated at the head table beside a man who could not be bothered to speak her name, Isolde let the whispers wash over her and did what she had always done. She observed. She filed things away. She built a map of the room in her mind. She noted which women smiled with their mouths but not their eyes when they looked at her. She noted which men watched Caspian with calculation rather than admiration. She noted the woman in the deep red gown who arrived 40 minutes into the dinner, uninvited, by the look of the footman's pale face, and took a seat near the back with the careless confidence of someone who expected to be forgiven for every transgression. Lady Karina Fenwick. Isolde had heard the name. Everyone had. The woman Caspian had loved for 6 years. The woman society expected he would eventually marry, until he had appeared at the Ravenswood estate on a cold October morning and offered Isolde a contract instead. She had never been told why. She suspected she never would be. But she watched Karina settle into her stolen seat and smile across the room at Caspian with the slow smile of a woman who considered herself already won, and Isolde understood then that her marriage was not simply cold. It was designed to be a cage. Caspian finally turned to Isolde at the end of the 5th course. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, as though he had just remembered she existed. "You are handling the attention well," he said. His voice was low, and from a distance, a casual observer might have mistaken it for warmth. Isolde set down her fork. "I have handled worse," she replied. He studied her for a moment, the kind of look that inventories rather than admires. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you have." Then he turned back to Aldrich, and the conversation moved on, and Isolde was once again invisible at the center of the most important room in England. She picked up her fork. She cut a precise square of pheasant. She lifted it to her mouth and chewed slowly, tasting nothing. This was what she had to learn to live inside. His deliberate, weaponized indifference. Not cruelty, exactly. Something more refined. He had married her not because he hated her, but because she would be useful, and because her father had once been something to him she did not yet understand. That mystery lived in the space between his cold gray eyes and his perfectly controlled voice, and Isolde filed it away with everything else. She would find it. She had time. The evening ended at 11:30. Carriages were called. Guests departed in a river of furs and farewells. Isolde stood at the door of Fenwick House beside Caspian and played the role of Duchess with such quiet perfection that 3 different dowagers stopped to compliment her composure. She curtsied. She thanked them. She smiled just enough. Caspian noticed. She could feel it in the tiny shift of his posture, but he said nothing. When the last guest had gone and the servants began extinguishing the candles, Aldrich Vale lingered. He was Caspian's cousin, tall and sandy-haired, with a smile that never quite reached his pale eyes. He kissed Isolde's hand with a courtliness so overdone it became its own mockery. "My dear cousin by marriage," he said, "what a remarkable evening! What a remarkable woman you must be, to endure it so gracefully." "Thank you," Isolde said, "though I am not sure what there was to endure." He smiled wider. "Quite right," he said. "Quite right." He bowed to Caspian and walked out into the night. Isolde watched him go and felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise, not from the cold that rolled in through the open door, but from something she could not yet name. A sense, deep and animal, that this man was measuring her, calculating something. She closed the door herself and went upstairs to her rooms alone. Her chamber at Ashenmoor, the Duke's principal London house, was enormous and beautifully furnished. The fireplace was lit. Her maid, a young woman named Bess who had arrived with the household and looked at Isolde with wide, watchful eyes, was waiting with a warm cloth and pins for her hair. Isolde sat at the dressing table and let Bess work in silence. In the mirror, she studied her own face, the shadows under her green eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the mouth that had learned very young to carry a smile it didn't always feel. She looked, she thought, remarkably intact for a woman who had just been publicly displayed and privately dismissed on her wedding night. "Will you be needing anything else, Your Grace?" Bess asked softly. The title startled her. She had forgotten for a moment that she was a duchess now. "No, Bess," she said. "Thank you." When the girl left, Isolde sat alone in the candlelight and pressed her hand flat against the cold surface of the dressing table. She let herself feel the silence. Then she straightened her spine, blew out the candle nearest her, and picked up her pen. She had a letter to write to her father. She wanted him to know she was safe. She wanted him to know she was not broken. She wanted it to be true when she wrote it. Outside in the hall, the house breathed around her, floorboards settling, wind finding the gaps in the old window frames, the distant sound of a clock striking midnight somewhere in the depths of Ashenmoor. 300 miles north in a Suffolk house with a leaking roof, her father was asleep, or trying to be, with the sound of the tenant children she had helped feed for 3 years playing somewhere in his waking dreams. And here she was, Isolde Ravenswood, now Isolde Vale, Duchess of Ashenmoor, sitting in a firelit room in a house that did not yet know her name, at the center of a marriage built to diminish her, in a world that had already decided she would fail. She dipped her pen. She wrote the date, January 14, 1831. She wrote, "Dear Father, the evening is over. I have survived it, and I intend to survive everything that follows. Do not worry about me. Worry only about resting. I will come when I can. Your Isolde." She sealed the letter, set it on the desk, and then she did something none of the 300 guests, None of the whispering women, none of the watching men, not even Caspian Vale himself would have expected from the quiet woman they had all decided was already beaten. She smiled. Not the careful, social smile she had worn all evening. A real one. Small and private and fierce as a spark in dry grass. She had been brought here to be broken. She had absolutely no intention of letting that happen. "3 months before the wedding, Isolde had been elbow-deep in the Ravenswood account books when the Duke of Ashenmoor's carriage arrived at the gate. She heard it before she saw it, the crunch of wheels on the long gravel drive, the whinny of horses bred so well they barely made a sound. She had gone to the window of her father's study and looked out. The carriage was black with silver trim. The horses were matched greys. The coachman wore Ashenmoor's livery, ash and deep blue. Isolde had set down her pen with absolute calm and said aloud to the empty room, "What on earth does the Duke of Ashenmoor want with us?" She had changed her dress in 4 minutes, the dark green wool, not the brown one with the fraying cuffs, and gone down to meet him. Caspian Vale was already standing in the entrance hall when she arrived. He was taller than she expected. Broader. The portraits she had seen at the county exhibitions flattered his jaw but failed entirely to capture the quality of his eyes. Cold, yes, but also acutely, uncomfortably intelligent. He had looked at her without a word for a moment that lasted just long enough to be slightly improper. Then he said, "Miss Ravenswood, I have a proposition." "I assumed," she said, "that you did not come all this way to admire the tapestries." He had almost smiled. Almost. He told her the terms plainly. No flattery, no poetry, no pretense of affection. The Duke of Ashenmoor required a wife of good family. He had considered several candidates and found each of them inadequate. Not for lack of beauty or fortune, he explained, those he could acquire elsewhere. What he required was a woman of sufficient intelligence and resilience to manage a household of 47 staff across 3 estates, to act as hostess to England's most demanding social calendar, and to do so without requiring his constant attention or emotional accommodation. He had observed her, he said, at 3 county events over the past 2 years, managing her family's deteriorating finances and social standing with a precision and equanimity he had found impressive. He was offering her a contract. Her family's debts, he named the exact figure, which meant he had done his research thoroughly and without mercy, would be paid. The Ravenswood estate would be repaired. Her father's medical care would be provided for as long as he lived. In exchange, she would become the Duchess of Ashenmoor, fulfill the requirements of the role, and produce an heir when the time came. Isolde had sat across from him in the drawing room, the one with the water stain on the ceiling that she always positioned guests away from, and listened to every word. When he finished, she said, "What you have described is a transaction, not a marriage." "Yes," he said. "I am aware of the distinction." "Then I have one question before I answer." "Ask it." "Why me? Specifically." With no flattery. He told her. His voice was measured, almost careful. And what he said was not what she had expected. Baron Ravenswood, her father, had, 20 years ago, been trustee of a financial arrangement that concerned Caspian's late mother. During a period when the Ashenmoor estate was in legal dispute following the previous duke's death, Ravenswood had transferred certain funds in a manner that, while not precisely illegal, had left the young Caspian without access to resources he needed at a critical moment. It had been a cold, opportunistic move by a man with his own debts and his own survival to consider. It had cost the young Caspian 2 years of struggle. He had never forgotten it. Isolde heard all of this without expression. The fire crackled between them. She thought of her father, gentle, bookish, prone to grand gestures and poor decisions, and understood that this was true. She did not defend him. She did not apologize for him. When Caspian finished, she said quietly, "You want me to pay for what my father did." He said, "I want a duchess who will serve her role." The history you have named is background context, not the contract. But his eyes said something different. His eyes said, I want to see if you will break. She had looked at those gray eyes and felt something settle hard and clear inside her, like a stone dropping to the bottom of a cold lake. Very well, she said. I will marry you. She paused. Caspian did not visit Ravenswood again before the wedding. They exchanged 2 letters, formal, brief, transactional. He did not inquire about her health, her feelings, or her preparations. She did not volunteer any information beyond what was required. On the last night before the ceremony, her father called her to his room. He was propped against 3 pillows, his face thinner than it had been even a month ago, his eyes filled with a complicated mixture of love and guilt that had lived in them for years. You do not have to do this, he said. There are other ways I can. No, she said gently. There aren't, father. He reached for her hand. His fingers were thin and cool. He is not a kind man, he said. I know. She squeezed his hand. I do not need kindness. I need purpose. He looked at her for a long time. His eyes were wet. Your mother would have understood, Isolde said firmly. She was the most practical woman I ever knew. He laughed, a small, sad sound like something breaking softly. She sat with him until he slept. Then she went to her own room and stood at the window looking out at the flat Suffolk dark, the fields that had fed generations of families who were still alive because of decisions she had made and money she had bargained for. She did not sleep much. But when the morning came, she washed her face with cold water, put on the ivory dress, pinned her mother's pearl comb in her hair, and walked out to be married. Her eyes were dry. Her spine was straight. She was ready. The church was small and old and smelled of candles and stone. There were 30 guests, a modest number for a duke, which itself was a statement. Caspian arrived before her and stood at the altar with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, as if he were waiting for a contract to be witnessed, which of course was exactly what he was doing. When Isolde walked down the aisle on her father's unsteady arm, she did not look for warmth in Caspian's expression because she was not expecting it. She looked instead for steadiness. She found it. Whatever else he was not a man who wavered. She could work with that. The vows were spoken. The ring, heavy, old, Ashenmore gold, was placed on her finger. They were pronounced husband and wife. He did not kiss her. He offered his arm instead. She took it. They walked back down the aisle together in perfect, absolute silence, and every person in the church understood that they were watching something unusual, a marriage not of love or convenience, but of calculation and concealment, and that the woman at the center of it was not the fragile creature they had assumed. She moved through the pews like water finding its level, quiet, inevitable, unstoppable. Only one person in the room seemed to truly see it. Aldrich Vale, seated in the 3rd row, watched Isolde pass with an expression she would not understand for months. Not contempt. Not admiration. Something calculating and cold. Something that looked, in hindsight, very much like worry. The wedding breakfast was held at the county house of Lord and Lady Peth, who had offered their home for the occasion with the enthusiastic anxiety of people who wanted to remain in the Duke's good graces. The table was long and white. The food was excellent. Caspian sat at one end and performed the role of gracious host with an ease that spoke of long practice, and Isolde sat at the other end and did the same. They were, in a sense, well matched for exactly this. 2 people who could perform composure under pressure. 2 people who had learned that dignity was a form of survival. The guests drank and laughed and made toasts, and the afternoon moved through its hours, and no one who had not been paying very close attention would have noticed the thing that Isolde noticed with crystalline certainty, that in the 6 hours of the wedding breakfast, Caspian did not once address her by name. Not Isolde. Not even my wife. When he needed to indicate her, to include her in a toast, to guide a guest toward her, he used gesture. A tilt of the head. An open palm. As though she were a feature of the room rather than a person within it. She noted this carefully. She understood what it was. It was the opening move of a very long game. And somewhere in the cold, bright part of herself that had kept her alive through 3 years of managing a dying estate on almost nothing, she decided that if it was a game he wanted, she was going to play it better than he had ever imagined. Ashenmore was beautiful the way a glacier is beautiful, vast, pale, and entirely indifferent to the small living things at its edges. The main estate stood on 600 acres of Derbyshire moorland, its stone face the color of old bone, its windows tall and many and reflecting back the sky in shades of grey and silver and winter blue. There were 3 wings, for drawing rooms, a library of 7,000 volumes, a portrait gallery of veils going back to the reign of James II, and a kitchen that could feed 40. There was also a east tower that no one used, a stable block that smelled of leather and clean hay, and a walled garden that had once been famous in 3 counties for its roses and was now severely overgrown. Isolde arrived at Ashenmore on a Thursday in late January, 6 days after the London dinner, in a carriage she shared with her trunk and her maid Bess and her own collected silence. Caspian had come ahead the day before. He was not at the door to meet her. Mrs. Brockett was, standing in the entrance with 2 senior footmen and a face that had been carefully arranged to show neither welcome nor hostility. "Your Grace," she said, "the household is ready for your inspection." "Thank you, Mrs. Brockett," Isolde said. "Give me 20 minutes to change out of these traveling clothes, and I will begin." Mrs. Brockett's expression shifted a fraction, surprised, perhaps, that she intended to begin at all. The inspection took 4 hours. Isolde moved through Ashenmore with the methodical attention of a woman cataloguing something she intended to rebuild. She noted the damp patch behind the east wing's wallpaper. She noted the coal allocation in the servants' hall, which was too low for the temperature of the winter and would need to be increased. She noted that 2 of the upstairs guest rooms had not been aired recently, that the linen cupboard on the 2nd floor was in excellent order, that the kitchen garden, though not Isolde's concern exactly, was being run efficiently by a gardener named Tam who grew enough root vegetables to supplement the estate's winter provisions significantly. She asked questions. Detailed, specific questions, the kind that could only be answered by someone who knew the house intimately. Mrs. Brockett, initially reserved, began to answer with increasing detail and, gradually, with something approaching respect. By the time they reached the estate office, the housekeeper was speaking with the candid ease of someone finally talking to a person who might actually understand what she said. Isolde sat at the estate desk. She would learn later it was technically the Duke's desk, and the look on Mr. Farron the steward's face when he arrived to find her there was remarkable, and spent 30 minutes reviewing the household accounts. There were 3 inefficiencies she identified immediately. She noted them on a piece of paper, folded it, and put it in her pocket. She would address them one at a time, quietly, without announcing herself. She did not see Caspian until dinner that evening. He was already seated when she came into the dining room, changed into a dark blue evening gown with jet buttons, her hair dressed plainly but well. He rose when she entered, courtesy, not warmth, and waited until she was seated before resuming his own seat. The dining room was lit by candles in 3 iron candelabra, and the light they cast was amber and uneven, warming the dark wood of the table and the old silver of. Over the days that followed, they established a kind of cold routine. Breakfast was taken separately, Caspian in his study, Isolde in the morning room, which she had begun to quietly reorganize with fresh flowers from the forcing house and better light. Dinner was shared but largely silent, except for the exchanges Isolde chose to initiate, always practical, always specific, always impossible to dismiss as mere conversation. He could not ignore a report about tenant cottage flooding or a question about the coal merchant's contract without either engaging or revealing a negligence he was too proud to be guilty of. She used this knowledge precisely. She was not confrontational. She was simply relentlessly, efficiently present. The staff noticed. Quietly, carefully, the way domestic staff always notice, in the particular angle at which they held doors, in the small additional detail added to her meals, in the way footmen who had initially deferred entirely to Mr. Farron began waiting to see if the Duchess had instructions before acting on his. She treated every member of the household with the same firm, clear, unhurried respect. She learned their names, all 47 of them, within her first week. Not as a performance. Because it mattered to her. Because these were people, and she had lived long enough among people who had been rendered invisible by wealth and power that she refused to do the same. Caspian watched all of this. She could feel it, not with warmth, not with interest, but with the particular attention of a man reassessing something he thought he had already calculated. He had expected, she thought, a woman who would wilt, who would retreat into the formal corners of her role and cause him no trouble and require no thought. What he had instead was someone who had begun, very quietly, to change the texture of his house, not through grand gestures or declarations, but through the accumulated weight of 100 small, careful decisions, each one utterly correct. It unsettled him. She was glad of it. One evening at the end of her second week, she came into the library to find a fire already lit and Caspian standing at the window with a glass of brandy, looking out at the dark moor. He did not turn when she entered. She selected a book from the shelves without comment, Gibbon's Decline and Fall, Volume 3, which she had been intending to reread for 2 years, settled into the chair nearest the fire, and began to read. He turned eventually and found her there. He looked at her for a moment. She did not look up. He crossed to his own chair, sat, opened the report he had brought, and read. They stayed that way for an hour, the fire between them, the wind outside, the two of them reading in silence, so complete and so strangely comfortable that when the clock struck 9 it was like waking from something neither of them had intended to fall into. It was on her third Friday that Karina came. Isolde was in the walled garden, assessing the rose situation with Tam, when she heard the carriage on the drive, a lighter vehicle than Caspian's, faster, belonging to someone who considered speed more important than dignity. She came around the corner of the garden wall and saw the woman stepping down from the carriage in a traveling gown of dark gold, her dark hair perfectly arranged despite the journey, her expression as she looked toward the house carrying the proprietorial ease of someone returning to somewhere they considered home. Karina Fenwick. Lady Karina now. She had briefly married a minor baronet who had died conveniently, which gave her That night, the three of them sat at dinner together, Caspian at the head of the table, Karina to his right, Isolde across. The food was excellent. The wine was the good Burgundy. And the conversation between Caspian and Karina moved with the fluid ease of people who had spent years learning each other's rhythms, finishing references, sharing private laughter, speaking in the abbreviated shorthand of long intimacy. Isolde ate. She listened. She watched them together and noted, with careful precision, the exact nature of what she was seeing, not current love, but the habit of love, which is in some ways harder to displace. Karina glanced at her between courses, always with a smile, always measuring. She asked Isolde questions that were designed to reveal inadequacy, how she was finding the northern winters after Suffolk, whether she had made many friends in the county, whether she found the management of such a large estate overwhelming after the rather more modest Ravenswood. Isolde answered each one directly and simply, with neither defensiveness nor performance. At the end of the meal, when the dessert had been cleared, Karina looked at her with an expression that was, for just a moment, unguarded. And what Isolde saw in it was not triumph. It was uncertainty. She did not let it show on her face. She rose, excused herself gracefully, said good night to them both with equal warmth, and walked upstairs. In her room, she stood at the window and looked out at the moor. "She is afraid of me," she said to the dark. "That is something." She went to bed and slept soundly. Karina stayed for 2 weeks. She had a gift for making herself essential to the texture of a room, arriving at precisely the moment a conversation needed wit, standing in the precise angle of light that showed her best, filling silences with laughter that sounded effortless because it had been practiced until it was. She redecorated the small drawing room, Isolde's small drawing room, the one she had claimed by quiet daily use, by simply taking it over with her embroidery frame and her visiting correspondence and her insistent, charming presence, until the room felt like hers again. She gave instructions to footmen. Not orders, exactly, suggestions, delivered with such warm authority that the footmen acted on them without thinking. She told Cook that the Duke preferred his lamb prepared differently from the way it had been coming out lately, which was the way Isolde had asked for it, after discovering it was the way Caspian had liked it as a child, from a detail Mrs. Brockett had let slip. It was beautifully done. Isolde watched it happen and made mental notes the way a general marks movements on a map. She did not fight any of it. She simply continued doing what she had been doing, her work, her household management, her daily rounds of the estate. She kept her voice pleasant and her expression open, and she gave Karina nothing to quote back, nothing to misrepresent, nothing to use. And she watched Caspian. He did not go to Karina's room. Isolde knew this because she had quietly, simply noted which hallways the night footman reported movement in, a domestic intelligence network she had established with complete naturalness over her first 3 weeks by the simple method of being interested in the staff's experience of the house. He did not go to Karina's room, but he spent long evenings with her in the study, and there was something in his posture around her, a slight loosening, a warmer register in his voice, that was absent when he was with Isolde. She did not feel wounded by this. She felt, instead, oddly clear-eyed. What Karina gave Caspian was ease. The ease of someone who did not challenge him, who reflected his brilliance rather than matching it, who required of him only charm rather than integrity. Isolde could not give him that. It was not in her. What she could give him was something rarer and, she suspected, ultimately more important. The truth, presented without cruelty, at moments when it mattered. Whether he would ever be willing to receive it was the question she could not yet answer. What she noticed, in those 2 weeks, was that the small household reforms she had set in motion continued to be implemented without comment. The East Wing damp was addressed. The coal allocation for the servants' hall was increased. 3 cottages in the North Field had their roofs examined, and repairs were scheduled for spring. She had not announced any of this. She had simply ensured it happened. Caspian did not acknowledge it, but he noticed. She could feel it. On the day Karina finally left, 12 days stretched to 14 by a conveniently persistent headache, she found Isolde in the morning room with the estate ledgers. Isolde looked up. Karina stood in the doorway in her traveling clothes, her dark eyes moving from the open ledgers to Isolde's face with an expression that was no longer quite as easy as it usually was. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she said. "Of course," Isolde said, setting down her pen. "I hope the journey will be comfortable." There was a pause. The kind that happens when 2 people have been circling each other long enough that all the polite things have already been said. "He married you to humiliate you, you know," Karina said. Her voice was quiet and even. Not vicious. Almost confiding. "Not you personally. Your family. Your father specifically. He was very angry for a very long time." "I know," Isolde said. Karina blinked. Whatever answer she had prepared for, it was not that one. "You knew," she said. "Yes." "And you married him anyway." "Yes." Another pause. Karina's expression did something complicated. cycled through several things in quick succession before settling on something that looked, improbably, almost like respect. "You are not what I expected," she said. "No," Isolde agreed. "I rarely am." Karina looked at her for another moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Be careful of Aldrich." She did not explain. She turned and walked out to her carriage, and the wheels crunched away down the drive, and Isolde sat very still with her pen in her hand and let the warning settle into her bones. Aldrich Vale had visited Ashenmore twice since the wedding, each time under the banner of family affection, each time staying 3 days, each time spending long hours in conference with the Duke that Isolde was not invited to and did not attempt to join. She had instead spent those hours in the estate office with Mr. Farron, whom she had by now won to a cautious but genuine professional alliance. Farron was a precise, anxious man who had been loyal to Ashenmore for 15 years and was deeply uncomfortable with things not being in order. Isolde's interest in the estate accounts had initially alarmed him. He had expected interference or ignorance, and instead received focused competence, which had alarmed him in a different way before eventually producing relief. She reviewed the accounts he showed her. She asked about the entail documents, the legal arrangements that governed what Ashenmore could and could not do with its land. Farron answered her questions. She said she was curious, by way of education, about the specific provisions regarding the dukedom's succession. Farron gave her a summary. She asked careful, precise follow-up questions. He answered them. Then she thanked him pleasantly and went back to the morning room. She sat for a long time with her hands folded in her lap and the window light cold on her face, thinking about a very specific provision Farron had mentioned, that in the event of the Duke's death without a legitimate heir, the dukedom would pass to the nearest male relative in the Vale line. The nearest male relative was Aldrich. And Aldrich, she was beginning to understand, was a very, very patient man. She built the picture slowly, the way she had always built things, piece by piece, without rushing, without showing what she was doing until she was sure. She talked to the tenants during her twice-weekly walks around the estate perimeter. An old man named Holes, who had farmed the lower field for 40 years, told her that young Master Aldrich, he still called him young, though Aldrich was 42, had been by to visit last spring, before Caspian's marriage. Had asked detailed questions about the land boundaries. About which parcels were entailed and which were freehold. Holes hadn't thought much of it at the time. Isolde thought a great deal of it. She talked to Mrs. Brockett, who had served Ashenmore through 2 dukes and knew its papers like her own family. Carefully, over several weeks of tea and domestic conversation, she established that certain documents relating to the estate's original land grant had been moved from their usual position in the estate's strongbox sometime in the past year. Farron thought they had been sent to the solicitor in London. The solicitor's office, when Isolde wrote, under the pretense of requesting a general document review, had no record of receiving them. She filed this information in the same cold, clear part of herself where she kept everything important. She said nothing to Caspian. Not yet. She did not yet know enough to be certain, and she would not go to him with half a truth and have him dismiss it. When she moved, she intended to have everything. Spring came to Ashenmore in long, low waves of green, the moorland releasing its winter gray in patches, gorse blooming first, violent, defiant yellow against the brown, then the grass, then the first pale leaves on the trees along the east drive. Isolde began work on the walled garden. She had no grand vision for it, no ambition to recreate the famous roses overnight. She simply started with what was there: the bones of a garden that had once been loved, the ancient climbing plants that had survived neglect because they were too stubborn to die. She worked in it herself on the mornings when her household duties were light, in old gloves and a plain cotton dress, with Tam beside her or ahead of her, pruning and clearing and turning the soil. The gardener had, by this point, become wholly devoted to her in the quiet, steadfast way of someone who recognizes a person who actually means what they say. Other staff drifted by the garden walls in the mornings, ostensibly on other errands, and stopped to talk. She always had time. She always remembered what had been said before and asked the next question. The household, in this organic and undramatic way, had begun to pivot around her. Not away from Caspian. Toward her as a thing apart. A center of competence and genuine care that did not depend on his recognition to exist. She planted the first new roses in April. She chose a variety called Maiden's Blush, pale, incredibly fragrant, extraordinarily hardy. She put her hands in the cold earth and pressed the roots down herself. She did not allow herself to think about how much she wanted them to grow. It was on a Tuesday evening in early May that Caspian came to the walled garden. He had not been there since her arrival, as far as she knew. She heard his footsteps on the path before she saw him, unhurried, distinctive. She was on her knees beside the east wall with a trowel, coaxing a stubborn root. She looked up. He stood at the gap in the wall where the gate had once hung, watching her. He was still in his riding clothes. He had been out since morning on estate business, and there was color in his face from the wind and something in his expression she had not seen before. He looked at her in the dirt with her plain gloves and her hair coming down on one side, and something moved across his face that she could not immediately name. Not contempt. Not assessment. Something more complicated than either. "Mrs. Brockett told me you had re-established the kitchen garden allocations," he said. "The ones from my mother's time." "Yes," she said. The gardener found the original plans in the estate office. It seemed worth restoring. He was quiet for a moment. "She designed them herself," he said. "My mother. She spent 2 summers getting them exactly right." His voice was even, controlled. She knew, from months of careful observation, that this level of control meant he was closer to feeling something than he would ever choose to admit. She pressed the root down carefully into the earth. "Then they should be preserved," she said. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and turned and walked back toward the house. She sat back on her heels and looked at the east wall and breathed. Something had changed. She was not sure yet what to do with that. Aldrich Vale arrived at Ashenmore on a Thursday in June without prior notice and with a smile that filled the entrance hall the way a bad smell does, immediately, completely, impossible to ignore. He had brought a friend, a Lord Cassius Price of somewhere in Wiltshire, a lean, elegantly dressed man with the particular social ease of someone who has spent his life in rooms where he was indulged. They were returning from a hunting party in the north, Aldrich explained to Caspian with the warmth of a man telling a story he has rehearsed slightly too well, and it had seemed so natural to stop in. So irresistible, when Ashenmore was only 40 miles from their route. Caspian received them with his usual composed courtesy. Isolde stood beside him in the entrance hall and watched Aldrich's eyes move across the improvements she had made to the house. The reupholstered entrance hall chairs, the restored tapestry by the main staircase, the flowers from the walled garden in a tall vase by the window, and noted the quality of his attention. He was cataloging just as she was. He was doing what any intelligent person does when they enter a space, assessing what has changed and what it means. But where Isolde catalogued in order to understand, she had the increasing conviction that Aldrich catalogued in order to possess. He kissed her hand with the same overdone courtliness as always. "Cousin Isolde," he said, "you look very well. Marriage suits you." "It does," she agreed pleasantly. "Welcome to." Over the next 4 days, Aldrich and Price occupied Ashenmore with the cheerful, expanding comfort of guests who intended to be accommodated no matter what. They hunted in the mornings, dined in the evenings with the easy amplitude of men who expected excellent meals and received them, and spent the afternoons in conference with Caspian in the study, meetings that Isolde was again not invited to and again did not attempt to join. She went instead to the estate office and spent those afternoons with Farron reviewing a set of documents she had quietly requested from the solicitor's London office, copies of the original Ashenmore land grant documents, which she had requested on the grounds that she wished to understand the estate's legal foundations. The solicitor, a dry, precise man named Whittle who had initially regarded her request with the suspicion older professional men reserve for women who ask legal questions, had sent them without comment after she wrote to him in the most technically detailed language she could manage, making it perfectly clear that she was not asking out of feminine curiosity but out of informed necessity. She had the copies now. She spread them on the estate office desk after Farron left for the evening and sat with them in the long summer light, reading every line. She compared them to the summaries in the estate accounts. She compared them to the figures in the more recent land registry documents that Farron had produced over the past months. She worked slowly because it was meticulous work, and because the thing she was looking for, the thing she suspected was there, could not be confirmed in haste. And then, on the third evening, she found it. It was small. A single figure that did not match. A boundary reference in the original grant that diverged from the same reference in a more recent estate survey document that had been submitted to the County Land Registry 6 months ago, 1 month before Caspian's engagement to Isolde. The discrepancy was not accidental. She knew this immediately because she understood land documents and because the specific nature of the alteration, a boundary adjustment that moved 12 acres of unentailed freehold land from Caspian's direct ownership into a holding arrangement referenced by a name she did not recognize, was too precise, too technically correct in its falsification, to be a clerical error. Someone had altered the survey document before submitting it to the registry. Someone who knew the original documents were unlikely to be cross-referenced. Someone who was, she understood now with cold and absolute certainty, in the process of extracting property from the dukedom in pieces, in a way that would only become apparent when the dukedom itself changed hands. She sat with this knowledge for a long time in the quiet estate office with the summer evening light turning the color of old honey outside the window. She thought about what it meant. She thought about who knew. She thought about what Caspian would say when she told him, because she would have to tell him, and whether he would believe her, and whether his instinct would be to dismiss the information because it came from her. And then she thought about Aldrich downstairs at the long dinner table with his warm smile and his practiced stories, sitting in a house he intended to eventually own, next to a duke he was quietly preparing to betray. She folded the documents, placed them in the inside pocket of her jacket, went to her room, did not sleep. She told no one for 3 days. She needed more. She wrote 2 careful letters, one to Mr. Whittle the solicitor, requesting the formal chain of document submissions to the county registry, and one to a firm of inquiry agents in Sheffield whose name she had found in a back issue of a legal periodical in the Ashenmore library. She sent both letters herself, early in the morning, before the household was fully awake, with Bess who she trusted absolutely and who had learned, without being told, to treat certain errands as invisible. In the meantime, she managed the household, walked the estate, tended the garden, sat at dinner, and gave no indication that anything had changed. This required a level of sustained composure that pressed against the edges of what she had thought she was capable of. She was aware, with a kind of distant precision, that she was carrying information that could dismantle a conspiracy, but that if she moved too early, with incomplete evidence, it would not dismantle it. It would simply scatter the pieces into places she could no longer reach. Aldrich was charming. Aldrich was clever. Aldrich had spent years, she now understood, constructing this slowly, patiently, with the meticulous care of someone who knew they would only get one chance to close the trap. She had one chance too. She was not going to waste it. She sat across from him at dinner on the 4th night and listened to him tell a story about a horse he had once owned, and she smiled at the right moments, and she watched his eyes the way a hawk watches a field, and she kept her own counsel absolutely. It was Price who gave her the final piece, and he gave it without knowing what he was giving. On the fourth afternoon, while Aldrich was closeted with Caspian, Price had wandered into the morning room where Isolde was writing correspondence. He was bored and slightly drunk from the midday wine, and he sat himself down across from her and talked. People like Price always talk to people who appear to be listening without threat. Isolde appeared to be listening without threat. She gave him tea. She asked pleasant questions. He told her about the hunting party, about mutual acquaintances in Wiltshire, about a legal matter he had been helping Aldrich with the previous winter, a small administrative business involving land survey documentation, he said vaguely, with the particular vagueness of someone who knows just enough to feel sophisticated but not enough to know when to stop talking. She kept her face perfectly neutral and asked a single, carefully casual follow-up question. Did it require many specialists? A surveyor fellow, Price said cheerfully. In Sheffield, I think. Very competent. Aldrich was particular about the accuracy. A surveyor in Sheffield. The same city where she had sent her letter to the inquiry agents. She set down her teacup with complete steadiness. How interesting, she said. More tea. She filled his cup. She asked him about his horse. He talked for another 20 minutes and revealed nothing more of substance. But she had what she needed. The chain was complete, and she would have the written documentation within the week. She was in the rose garden the next morning, Thursday just after dawn, the air cold and smelling of damp grass and the first opening blooms, when Caspian found her. He came alone. No obvious purpose. He stood at the gate the way he had before and looked at her with that same expression she still had not fully named. She had been deadheading the earliest roses, and her fingers were stained with petal dye and dew. She looked up. He looked older than usual in the morning light. There were lines at the corners of his eyes she did not recall seeing at the wedding. She thought, for a moment, of what it cost a person to carry anger for 20 years. Aldrich tells me he has found a buyer for the North Field parcels, he said. His voice was neutral. She felt the information land in her chest like a stone. So that was how he intended to do it. Openly, under the guise of an estate rationalization, using documents he had already altered to support the sale. The North Field parcels, she said carefully. Are they unentailed? He frowned. Yes. It's freehold land. It would be a reasonable sale if the estate needed the liquidity. She looked at him for a long moment. I would like to review the land registry documents for those parcels before any sale is agreed, she said. In my capacity as co-manager of the household estates. He stared at her. You have no legal capacity in that regard, he said. No, she agreed. But you might agree as a courtesy, given that I have some concerns. The word hung in the still morning air between them. What concerns? He asked. And she looked at him, this cold, difficult, complicated man she had married, and made a decision. Give me until Friday, she said. Then I will show you. He gave her until Friday. She did not know why. He had every reason to dismiss the request, to close the door, to proceed with Aldrich's plans in whatever form they were taking shape. Perhaps it was the quality of her voice when she asked, not pleading, not emotional, simply certain in a way that demanded to be taken seriously. Perhaps it was something else, some accumulation of all the small things he had observed and filed away over 4 months that told him that when this woman said she had concerns, they were worth hearing. Whatever the reason, he said, Friday morning, 9 o'clock. My study. And she nodded, and he went back into the house. And she stood in the rose garden for a moment with her stained fingers and her cold face turned to the pale morning sky, and felt the weight of what she was carrying. The letter from the inquiry agents had arrived the day before by the afternoon post. It confirmed the surveyor's identity. It confirmed the date of the document alteration 16 months ago, 6 months before Caspian's engagement, 4 months before the land registry submission. It included the name of the third party in the holding arrangement, Aldrich Vale, registered under his mother's maiden name, Aldrich Southern. Everything she needed was folded in her jacket pocket against her heartbeat. On Friday, she would lay it before Caspian, and then, whatever came next, she would have done what she could. What happened after that was in his hands. She pressed her fingers against one of the roses, the maiden's blush, the hardiest one, the first to flower. On Friday morning at precisely 9 o'clock, Isolde walked into Caspian's study and laid 3 documents on his desk. She placed them without preamble and without explanation, and then she sat in the chair across from him and waited. He looked at her first, searching, she thought, for whether she was nervous, and then he looked at the documents. He picked up the first one. She had annotated it in pencil, marking the boundary reference numbers with neat precision. He picked up the second, the more recent survey document, and held them side by side. He was silent for a long time. She watched his face. The control was extraordinary. He was the kind of man who had trained himself so thoroughly not to show feeling that even now, reading something that should have cracked the foundation of what he believed about his cousin, his expression moved through its revelations in a register so small that only someone who had spent 4 months learning to read him would have caught the sequence. Disbelief, calculation, fury, and then, underneath the fury, quieter and far more painful, betrayal. He set both papers down. He picked up the third, the inquiry agent's report, with the surveyor's name and the registered holding name at the bottom. He read it once. He read it again. He looked up at Isolde. "How long have you known?" "I suspected for 6 weeks," she said. "I have had written confirmation for 4 days." His jaw tightened. "Why did you wait?" "Because suspicion is not evidence," she said. "And because I needed to be certain before I brought it to you. If I had been wrong, you would not have come to me at all." "No," she said. "I would not have." He stared at her. "You were protecting me," he said. His voice was strange. "From being wrong," she said carefully. "About which of us was untrustworthy." He said nothing for a very long time after that. Isolde waited. She was good at waiting. The clock on the study mantelpiece ticked. Somewhere outside, a wood pigeon was singing in the lime trees. Caspian sat very still and looked at the documents, and she could see him doing what she had done, building the picture backward, finding all the moments that now meant something different, reassembling 6 years of a cousin's friendship into its true shape. It was a painful thing to watch. She did not look away. She thought it was important to witness the things that were hard, not only the things that were comfortable. Finally he said, "He intends to challenge the succession." "I believe so," she said. "The altered survey document creates grounds for a legal dispute over the boundary definition of the entailed versus the freehold land. If a sale proceeds on the freehold parcels before the discrepancy is discovered, it establishes a precedent, a documentary record of Ashenmore land being treated as separately owned, that could be used in a challenge to argue that portions of what is considered entailed are in fact not." He was watching her with the kind of focused attention he had previously reserved for his lawyers. "And without a legitimate heir," he said slowly, "if a succession challenge were lodged, the matter would be adjudicated," she said. "And depending on how the documents were read, the outcome would be uncertain at best." He sat back in his chair. He rubbed his jaw once, in a gesture she had never seen him make before, and the unexpectedness of it made something ache in her chest. He looked suddenly, briefly, terribly tired. "You should not have had to find this," he said. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "No," she agreed. "But I did. So here we are." She had expected him to act immediately, to call for Aldrich, to confront him, to do what powerful men do when they feel threatened, move fast and hard. He left after 20 minutes without having said anything that mattered, which meant he had come only to assess her, to take the temperature of whatever he had sensed. She went back to her letter and finished it, then sat with her hands folded and thought carefully about the evening ahead. Dinner would be a performance. She had always known how to perform. What she had not anticipated, what she could feel now, running beneath the practical calculations like water under ice, was fear. Not for herself. For Caspian. Because she had been watching him for 4 months and she had built a picture of who he was that was more complicated and more human than the cold, weaponized indifference he showed the world. She had found, in the architecture of his household management, evidence of someone who cared deeply about the land and its people, even as he kept that care heavily armored. She had found it in the way Mrs. Brockett spoke of the previous Duchess, Caspian's mother, and the way Caspian never spoke of her at all, which amounted to the same thing in reverse. She had found it in the garden he had let go to ruin because he could not bear to maintain something that belonged to someone he had lost. She had found it in the slight alteration of his voice when he mentioned his mother's garden plans, the one unguarded moment in 4 months. He was not the man he chose to present. He was a man who had built a prison around himself and called it dignity. And Aldrich, charming, patient, treacherous Aldrich, was planning to rob him inside it. The fear she felt was not for herself. It was the fear of watching someone be hurt and not knowing yet whether you will be in time. Dinner that night was a performance of high quality by all three of them. Caspian was composed and controlled. Aldrich was warm and expansive. Isolde was pleasant and present and said precisely enough and not a syllable more. Price drank too much wine and told a long story about a race meeting that no one else cared about. The candles burned down. The food was eaten. The dessert plates were cleared. And then, just as the evening began to wind toward its conclusion, Aldrich set down his glass and said, almost casually, "Caspian, I've heard from the interested party in the North Field sale. They want to move quickly. If we could finalize the terms by Monday, the transfer could be registered before the summer quarter." The table was very still for a moment. Price had stopped talking. Isolde kept her gaze on the middle distance and breathed, slow and steady. She felt Caspian's attention shift, not visibly, not to anyone watching, but she felt it, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. "Monday is not convenient," Caspian said. His voice was exactly as it always was. "I'll have Farron contact your party and arrange a new date." A pause so small most people would have missed it. Then Aldrich smiled. "Of course," he said. "No rush." But his eyes, for just a moment, were not smiling at all. He had heard something in the word, Monday, that told him the ground had shifted. Isolde picked up her wineglass and turned it slowly between her fingers and looked at the flame of the nearest candle and thought, now. Later, when the house was quiet and Price was asleep and Aldrich was in his room presumably recalculating, Caspian knocked on the door of Isolde's sitting room. She had expected this. She had a lamp lit and the documents spread on the writing table and a pot of tea, untouched, beside her. He came in without ceremony and sat. He left on Sunday. Aldrich and Price stayed. This was intentional. Caspian had invited them to remain, with the warm and entirely deceptive explanation that he would be back within the week and he wouldn't dream of cutting short their visit. Aldrich accepted this with perfect grace. Isolde managed the house. She was measured and pleasant and as apparently incurious as ever. She took her morning rides, attended to the household and estate duties, spent time in the garden, wrote her letters, read in the evening. On Monday evening, Aldrich came to the morning room again. This time he did not bother with pleasantries. He sat down, crossed his arms, and said directly, "My cousin trusts you." "Yes," she said. "He does." "I wonder," he said, "if that trust is entirely warranted. It strikes me that a woman who married a duke for his money, you have the history somewhat wrong," she said, still looking at her letter. "I married a duke who offered me a contract in exchange for services. I have performed those services competently. As for trust, trust is earned. I am in the process of earning it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, quietly and without any of the warmth, "Do not interfere in things that are not your concern." She looked up at him. At last, the real Aldrich. Smaller, colder, and significantly less charming than his social self. "The management of this estate," she said, "is precisely my concern." They looked at each other for a long moment. Then she said pleasantly, "Would you like some tea?" He stood. "I think," he said, "I will be leaving tomorrow." "Safe travels," she said and turned back to her letter. Aldrich was gone by dawn. Price left with him, having clearly been given no explanation but sufficient instruction to pack quietly and quickly. Isolde was already up. She had slept lightly, listening, and watched their carriage disappear down the drive from the east wing window with a coldness in her chest that was not triumph. It was the sensation of a clock being set, a mechanism beginning its final count. Whatever Aldrich intended to do next, he intended to do it before Caspian returned from London, which meant she had, at most, 3 days. She went to the estate office. She sat with the documents she had, with Farron's quiet assistance, assembled over the past week. The comparison documents, the inquiry agent's report, her own annotated analysis, and the letter from Whittle's office in London confirming the chain of document submission. She also had something new, a note from Caspian, dispatched by early post from his London hotel, saying that he had met with his solicitor that morning and that the original land grant documents were indeed missing from the solicitor's files. Someone had been there first. He wrote, "Be careful." 2 words. She folded them into her pocket and pressed her hand against them for a moment. Then she wrote 3 letters. One to Caspian, with the full details of everything she had assembled, in the event that something happened before he returned. One to Mr. Whittle, requesting a formal copy of every document ever submitted by or on behalf of Aldrich Sutton to the county land registry. And one to the county sheriff, whom she had met briefly at the local magistrate's dinner in March and who had struck her as a precise and serious man. She wrote the 3rd letter very carefully. She did not overstate. She did not accuse without evidence. She simply laid out what she had and requested, formally and quietly, that a record of the concern be made. The week that followed was the hardest of Isolde's life, and she had had some hard ones. Caspian remained in London, working through the legal mechanisms with his solicitor, a process that could not be rushed without risking mistakes, and mistakes were exactly what Aldrich was counting on. Karina, mysteriously, reappeared. Not at Ashenmoor. Isolde's quiet efficiency had made Ashenmoor inhospitable to uninvited arrivals, but in the county, at the house of a mutual acquaintance, from where she dispatched a note to Caspian suggesting, with arch concern, that she had heard troubling things about certain documents being questioned and that perhaps a mutual friend, she named Aldrich, had information that would be helpful. Isolde intercepted nothing. She was not in the habit of reading her husband's correspondence. But she learned of the note from Mrs. Brockett, who had it from the footman who delivered it, who had heard the other footman discuss it, which was the nature of household intelligence, invisible, comprehensive, and essentially impossible to suppress. Karina was aligned with Aldrich. Or at least Aldrich had recruited her. The information moved something in Isolde that she was careful not to examine too closely, not jealousy, but the particular exhaustion of someone who had been generous with. On the Wednesday evening, a man arrived at the estate, not by the main drive, but by the back road, in a plain dark coat, with a thin leather case. He asked for the Duchess and was brought to the estate office where Isolde was working late, as she often was now. He introduced himself as Mr. Hatch from Sheffield, no relation to the housekeeper, and produced from his leather case a set of documents that were, in the quiet lamplight of the estate office, the most important pieces of paper she had ever held. They were the original survey records from the Sheffield surveying firm, the actual working documents from the commission that Aldrich Sutton, had hired to produce the altered boundary report. They showed every stage of the process. The original measurements, the first draft, the corrections, the specific alterations made, in different ink, dated 2 days later, to the boundary reference numbers. The final version, which had been submitted to the county registry. And the name on the commission contract, Aldrich Vale, signed with his legal name rather than his alias, because he had been careless once, at the beginning, before he understood the importance of covering his tracks. He had been careless once. It was enough. Isolde sat very still for a long time. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the summer night moved through its own darkness and quiet. Then she said to Mr. Hatch, "Will you accept a letter of engagement and payment by bank draft?" "Yes, Your Grace," he said. I will need an additional copy of these documents for legal proceedings, she said. I have one here, he said, and produced a second set from the case. She filed everything. She thanked him. She sent him to the kitchen for supper and wrote immediately to Caspian, "Come home. I have it all." He arrived on Friday morning. She heard the carriage before she saw it, the matched grays, the ash and blue livery, and she was at the door of the estate office when he came in, still in his traveling coat, his face carrying the particular quality of someone who has not slept well in a week. He looked at her and she looked at him, and she handed him the second set of survey documents without speaking. He took them to the desk. He read them. He set them down. He stood with his hands braced on the edge of the desk and his head lowered and breathed. She did not move. She gave him the time. After a minute he straightened. His eyes, when he looked at her, were the least controlled she had ever seen them. "How?" he said. His voice was quiet and cracked at the edge. "Sheffield Inquiry Agents," she said. A surveying firm that still had its working copies. "You hired inquiry agents?" "Yes." "When?" 7 weeks ago." He stared at her. "7 weeks ago?" he said. "You knew about this 7 weeks ago and managed everything in this house. Managed me, managed Aldrich, managed Karina." He stopped. She waited. "You were protecting it," he said. "All of it. The house. The land. Me." He was not asking a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes," she said simply. "Why?" The question was direct and unguarded in a way she had never heard from him. She met it with the same. "Because I live here too," she said. "Because the tenants who depend on this estate have not done anything wrong. Because the house your mother loved deserves better than to be stolen." She paused. "And because you are not a villain, Caspian, even if you have sometimes behaved like one. You are simply a man who has been afraid for a very long time." He said nothing. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, something vast and quiet and long overdue. His eyes were bright. He did not look away. The legal proceedings moved with a speed that surprised even Isolde. Caspian's solicitor, armed with the Sheffield documents, filed with the county registry within 24 hours of his arrival at Ashenmore. The county sheriff, who had held Isolde's carefully worded letter for exactly the correct number of days, appeared at Aldrich's London address on Saturday morning with a formal inquiry. Aldrich, to his credit, did not panic publicly. He presented himself as a man wrongly accused, expressed shock and hurt and fraternal betrayal with the practiced fluency of someone who had prepared for this moment. But the documents were the documents. The surveyor testified. The chain of evidence was complete. Price, when interviewed separately, revealed, with the particular devastation of a man who has had his comfortable loyalties abruptly reorganized, that he had indeed accompanied Aldrich to the Sheffields. Karina sent a letter to Caspian on the Tuesday of the following week. Isolde did not know its contents. She knew of its arrival from the footman's tray, as she had before, and she waited to see if Caspian would mention it. He came to the morning room that evening. He had begun appearing there more often, without explanation or fanfare, simply settling into the other chair as though the habit had always existed, and he told her about it himself. He sat in the chair across from her, his long legs stretched toward the fire, his posture the most genuinely relaxed she had seen, and said, "Karina has written to me." "I know," Isolde said. He looked at her, not surprised. "She says she was misled by Aldrich and had no intention of helping him to deceive me." "Is that true?" she asked. He considered. "Partly," he said. "She knew more than she is claiming. But not, I think, the full extent." He was quiet for a moment. "She has asked if I will receive her." Isolde kept her expression even and her voice level. "That is your decision," she said. "Is it?" he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with a directness that was different from any of his usual assessments, quieter, more serious, without calculation. "Yes," she said. "I don't issue instructions about your relationships." He held her gaze. "And if I told you that I had no intention of receiving her? That there is no welcome for her here anymore?" Isolde looked at the fire. "Then I would think," she said carefully, "that you are perhaps further along than I had estimated." He made a sound, not quite a laugh, but close enough. She looked back at him. Their eyes held. The fire between them was warm. The evening was very quiet. Late that night, long after the house had gone to sleep, Isolde sat at her writing desk with her pen and a sheet of paper and wrote to no one in particular. Simply wrote, the way she had done since she was a girl, to process what she felt by finding its shape in words. She wrote, "I came here to be broken. I knew it then and I know it now. He married me to punish a bloodline, to extract something from my father's old debt, to have a useful wife he could dismiss with impunity and feel justified in the dismissing. He expected to find a woman who would wilt. He found instead a woman who had been trained, by everything life had asked of her, to be exactly what was needed in exactly this situation. I am not sure this is entirely comfortable. I am not sure I want to be known primarily as the woman who was harder to break than he expected. But I am beginning to suspect that the story is not finished yet. That what began as his intention to break me has become, in some way neither of us designed, something else entirely. Something I do not yet have a word for." She stopped. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote below it, "He said my name. He said thank you. He came to the morning room and sat by the fire and told me about Karina's letter without being asked. These are small things. They are also not small at all." She folded the paper, put it in the desk drawer, went to bed. Through the tall window, the moor lay silver and enormous under the summer stars, unchanged and unmoved by the human dramas at its edge. Inside, the house breathed around her, settled, quiet, still hers. The formal scandal broke in September, the way autumn broke, suddenly, all at once, with an overnight cold that left the mornings changed. The county knew within the week. London knew within the fortnight. And what London knows, England knows, and what England knows, the drawing rooms of every peer in the kingdom knew before the October quarter. Aldrich Vale, born Aldrich Sutton on his mother's side, which the gossips found deliciously appropriate, had been found to have fraudulently altered legal documents pertaining to the Ashenmore dukedom. The evidence was unassailable. The legal proceedings were moving. And while Caspian had handled the matter with characteristic composure, issuing formal statements through his solicitor and declining every invitation to public comment, the social earthquake his cousin's betrayal sent through their world was significant. Because Aldrich had been charming. Aldrich had been trusted. Aldrich had been a fixture at every significant gathering in the county for 15 years, and the people who had eaten his dinners and laughed at his stories and introduced him to their daughters felt, on some particular level, personally affronted that he had been doing something dishonest the whole time. Affronted and, in many cases, quietly afraid. Who else had they trusted who had not deserved it? The county's social circle contracted with the anxious speed of people protecting their dignity. Invitations were retracted. Associations were quietly severed. House parties scheduled for the autumn were abruptly postponed. His allies were the first to go. Lord Pemstock, who had supported several of Caspian's business arrangements over the years, sent a note withdrawing from their most recent joint venture. Nothing personal, he wrote, merely a matter of prudence. Lord Caswick, whose daughter had been informally considered for Caspian's hand before Isolde arrived, suddenly developed concerns about the character of the Ashenmore dukedom that he expressed to mutual acquaintances rather than directly. Two men who had served with Caspian on the county magistrates' committee requested reassignment to a different panel, given the circumstances. None of them said openly that they doubted him. They simply withdrew the warmth of their proximity, one by one, and left behind a carefully maintained space of polite neutrality that was, in its way, more damaging than open accusation. Caspian observed all of this with a face that gave nothing away. He continued to attend his meetings, to manage his estate, to correspond with his solicitor and his business partners with the same controlled precision as always. He did not speak about any of it to Isolde. She knew because she watched, and because Mrs. Brockett told her small things, and because the mood of a house changes when the person at its center is quietly in pain. She watched him and she said nothing, and she continued to do what she had always done. Her work, her steady visible management of the estate, her presence in every morning she rose and every evening she sat by the fire, and every day she kept the house running exactly as it should. Karina visited one last time in October. Not to Ashenmore. Caspian had not responded to her Tuesday letter or to the two that followed it, but to the county assembly in Matlock, where she appeared in her dark gold gown and moved through the room with her usual elegant ease, smiling at everyone, accepting their sympathy for having been associated with such an unfortunate matter through her friendship with Aldrich. She did not look at Isolde directly for the first hour. Then she did, across the width of the room, and what passed between them in that single look was something Isolde had not expected. Karina looked, not triumphant, not bitter, not scheming. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had played a long game and found, at its conclusion, that she was not sure why she had wanted to win it. She raised her glass, very slightly, in Isolde's direction. Isolde held her gaze for a moment. Then she returned the gesture, precise, minimal, not unkind. They did not speak. Karina left the assembly early. She was not seen in the county again that season. At the same assembly, several women, wives of Caspian's departing allies, women whose husbands had been at school with Aldrich and who now needed to demonstrate that they had not been fooled, came to Isolde with the elaborate, slightly desperate warmth of people recalibrating. They praised her composure. They praised her management of such a difficult year. They praised the walled garden, which had become known in the county by this point. Isolde thanked them pleasantly and said very little, and gave them nothing to repeat that could later be used, and thought of the difference between warmth and weather, one you could rely on and one you could not. November brought the formal closing of the legal proceedings and the first real public acknowledgement of what Isolde had done. The county solicitor, speaking at the magistrates' board meeting, to which she had not been invited but from which information reached her the following day through Farron, stated formally that the evidence which had enabled the fraud to be detected and prosecuted had been gathered, in its essential form, by the Duchess of Ashenmore. The statement was reported in the county newspaper. The county newspaper was read by everyone. Isolde was in the morning room when Bess brought her the paper, folded to the relevant page, with the particular expression of a young woman delivering something she suspects is important. Isolde read the paragraph. She read it twice. She set the paper down on the desk and looked out the window at the November garden. The roses cut back now, the ground dark, the walled garden bare and skeletal and waiting for spring. She thought about what it meant to have her name in print for the first time. Not as a social notation, the Duchess of Ashenmore attended, but as an actor. Someone who had done something. She felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief. It was closer to the feeling of a weight settling into a place it was meant to be, not lifted, but placed right. She also knew, with a precision that was beginning to feel like a kind of gift, that this moment, her name in the paper, the recognition of what she had done, would make some people more comfortable with her and others significantly less so. Caspian left for London in early December, ostensibly to close the final legal matters with his solicitor. He was gone for 3 weeks. They were 3 quiet weeks at Ashenmore, cold, bright, the Derbyshire winter settling into the stone of the house with its particular authority. Isolde kept the household. She ordered the preparations for Christmas, though they would be modest this year. There were no house parties planned, no great gathering of the county's social core. She supervised the cottages on the north edge of the estate where 2 of the older tenant families needed winter wood brought in. She continued the walled garden's preparation for its next season, ordering roses from a specialist supplier in London, planning the layout with Tam over the kitchen table on cold afternoons. She wrote to her father every Thursday. She did not tell him about the legal proceedings. She had protected him from all of it with the same careful instinct that had governed her approach to everything in this house. He had enough weight on him already. She told him the roses were planned for spring. She told him the house was well. She told him she was, without qualification, all right. And she was. She had been afraid, in the dark weeks of September and October, that the departures, the social withdrawal, the cool neutrality of people who had never genuinely warmed to her in the first place, would produce in her the loneliness she had armored against since childhood. They did not. They produced instead a strange, clean clarity. She knew who she was. She knew what she had done. She did not require anyone else to confirm it. Caspian came back on a Thursday. She heard the carriage at 4:30, and she was in the morning room with her letter to her father half finished, and she stayed there. She did not go to the entrance hall to meet him. She heard his arrival through the house, Mrs. Brockett's measured greeting, the transfer of hat and coat, the footsteps moving down the corridor. The morning room door opened. He came in. He looked different from when he had left, not older, but more settled, as though something had resolved itself in the weeks away. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "You didn't come to meet me," he said. "No," she said. "I thought you might want a moment." He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her. His chair now, in the way that things become yours by the repetition of returning to them. He looked at her letter. "Your father?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I met with Whittle. The final documents are filed. It's done." "Good," she said. He leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees and looked at his hands. "3 of my former allies have written to express renewed confidence," he said. "Since the newspaper article." His voice was entirely even. "I decline to respond to any of them." She looked at him. He looked up. "People who leave," he said, "and then return when it is convenient, I find I have less patience for that than I once did." He held her gaze. "I wonder," he said quietly, "if you have any thoughts on that subject." She let the silence stand for one breath. Then she said, "I think the quality of someone's loyalty is shown by what they do when things are difficult, not by what they do when things are resolved." He was very still for a moment. Something in his face, some last-held thing, released. It happened quietly, the way ice goes out of a river in spring. Not dramatically, but finally, completely, without reversal. He said, "I owe you more than I know how to say." She considered this carefully. She could deflect, it would be easy. She had been deflecting for months, keeping her own needs at arm's length, serving the purpose and the house and the people in it without requiring anything to be named. But she was tired of deflecting. She was, she realized, allowed to receive something. "You owe me on." They talked until the fire burned low and the winter dark outside the windows turned from gray to black and the clock struck 10 and then 11 and neither of them moved to end it. Not the management of the house or the legal proceedings or the social landscape of the county in the aftermath of Aldrich's exposure. They talked about themselves. It began carefully, the way conversations that matter begin, with the caution of two people who have not done this before and are aware of how much is at stake. She asked him about his mother. He answered, slowly at first, and then with increasing detail, and the detail became texture, and the texture became feeling, and the feeling became something she held with enormous care, the way you hold something you know is fragile and valuable and has not been shown to anyone before. His mother had died when he was 15. He had been at school. The letter had been held by the headmaster for 48 hours before being given to him, because the headmaster believed in the character-building properties of delayed grief. Caspian had received the letter on a Tuesday morning in February. He had read it in the school courtyard. He had folded it precisely. He had gone to his afternoon Latin class and received a commendation for his translation and said nothing to anyone for 11 days. Isolde heard all of this and did not speak and did not look away. She understood, with a comprehensiveness she had not expected, why a 15-year-old boy who had learned that the most efficient response to devastating pain was silence and control had grown into a man who used silence and control as weapons. She did not say this. She simply sat with him in it. He asked her about the Ravenswood tenants. She told him, the real version, not the managed summary she had given before. The winter when the drainage had failed and 4 families had had their root cellars flood and she had spent 3 days moving supplies from her own family's stores, which were barely sufficient, because it was that or watch children go hungry. The summer she had discovered the account books had been falsified by a steward who had since left, and had spent 6 weeks quietly rebuilding the records from scratch so that the tenants' lease payments would be calculated correctly. The morning she had ridden to the village to tell old Mr. Carver that despite the state of the Ravenswood finances, he would not be asked to vacate his cottage, and the way he had looked at her, with a gratitude so enormous it had been almost painful to receive, and how she had ridden home afterward and sat in her father's study for a very long time not crying, because crying was not useful, but feeling the weight of what it meant to be responsible for people's lives and having nowhere to put that weight except back on her own shoulders. Caspian listened to all of this with the focused, uninterrupted attention of a man who had spent years managing his own responsibilities in complete isolation and was now, for the first time, sitting with someone who had done the same and survived it. He said, "You have been carrying this since you were a child." "Yes," she said. "As have you," she added. He looked at her. He did not deny it. "Yes," he said. They came, eventually, to the question that had waited longest. He asked it simply, "Why did you stay?" She had known it was coming. She had prepared an answer, the practical one, the honest but incomplete one, because of the contract, because of the tenants, because leaving would have meant her father's debts returning and the Ravenswood families losing their homes. It was all true. It was not all of the truth. She looked at him and she gave him the full truth instead. "I stayed," she said, "because every time I thought there was nothing here worth staying for, I found something else. The garden your mother built. Farron's meticulous care for this land. Mrs. Brockett's 30 years of loyalty. The families in the North Field cottages who have farmed this ground for 4 generations. And," she paused, "because I saw, from the very beginning, that you were not the man you were trying to be. You were something harder and better than that, and I was not willing to leave before you could become it." The room was very quiet. He looked at her for a long time. His gray eyes were bright in the firelight. He said, "I married you to break something." "I know," she said. "And you thought that made you the one with the power," she said. "But you gave me a house, and a purpose, and a garden, and 47 people to care for, and a fraud to uncover, and a dukedom to protect. And in doing all of that, you gave me everything I needed to become the most necessary person in your life." He stared at her. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." "So you see," she said, "it is possible that the one who was broken was not me." Something cracked in him then. She saw it happen, not in a dramatic way, not with tears or noise. It was quieter than that, and more total. The control he had maintained for 20 years, the armor that had been his mother's death and his cousin's betrayal and his father's cold house and the 15-year-old boy in the school courtyard folding his letter and going to Latin class, all of it released at once, not in collapse but in recognition. He dropped his head into his hands and sat there, and the silence that surrounded him was different from any silence she had heard from him before. She moved. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the settee, and she did not speak, and she did not offer any of the comfortable, distancing words that she might have used. She simply placed her hand on his back. Just that. Present. Steadied. He did not flinch away. He sat there for a long time, and she sat beside him, and the fire burned down to embers, and the clock struck midnight, and the winter pressed its dark face against the windows, and in the house that she had quietly, patiently made into something worth living in, both of them breathed. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clear. He looked at her with the directness that was the one thing she had always respected in him, even in his coldness, the refusal to look away from what was true. "I have wasted a significant amount of time," he said. "Yes," she said. "You have. I intend to stop wasting it." She held his gaze. "Good," she said. "I intend to hold you to that." He looked at her, this woman who had come to his house to be broken and had instead rebuilt everything she touched, and said, "I imagine you will." And she almost smiled. Almost. Not the careful, social smile. The real one. The next morning arrived quietly. December light over the moor, pale, clean, sharp at the edges. Isolde rose early, as she always did, and dressed without Bess. She had always preferred to do this herself when she could, and went down to the morning room to find the fire already lit and a pot of tea already made and Caspian already there. He was standing at the window with his cup, looking out at the garden. He turned when she came in. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the morning held around them. Then he said, "I've written to my solicitor to establish a formal co-management arrangement for the estate. You will have full legal capacity in all matters related to Ashenmoor's lands and household." She absorbed this. It was more than she had expected, and more than she would have asked for, and the fact that he had moved to do it before she was even awake was, she noted, very like him. Not gesture, not grand declaration. Just action. Done correctly. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. She poured her tea. She sat at the desk where she always sat. He came and sat in his chair. They were quiet together in the comfortable, inhabited way of two people who have found, after a long and difficult season, that they can simply be in the same room without either of them diminishing. She opened the morning correspondence. He picked up the estate survey he had been working on. Outside, the first light was finding the walled garden, bare and silent, the rose stems cut back, the dark earth patient beneath its frost, waiting for what it knew was coming. She wrote to her father that afternoon. She told him what she had not told him in all the months before, not the legal proceedings, not the fraud, not the season of departures and recalibrations. She told him about the garden. She told him about the maiden's blush roses and their extraordinary stubbornness and the way they had grown beyond all expectation from their cold planting in April. She told him that Ashenmoor, which had felt like a museum when she arrived, felt now like a house. The place where someone lived and worked and intended to stay. And then, carefully, without drama, because her father was a man who heard what was between words rather than in them, she wrote, "I think I may be happy, Father. Not in the way I imagined when I was young. Not in a simple way. But in the way that things which are built over time become real and solid and yours. In that way, I'm well. The tenants are well. The house is in better order than it has been in years. And the Duke," she paused, her pen above the paper. "The Duke," she wrote, "has turned out to be considerably more complicated than either of us expected. I find I do not mind this." She sealed the letter. She handed it to Bess for posting. She went back to her desk and sat for a moment with her hands folded and the winter light on the window and the quiet house around her. From somewhere in the house she could hear Caspian's voice. He was speaking with Farron, she thought, about the North Field boundary restoration. His voice carried the easy authority of a man discussing something he intends to get right. She listened to it for a moment without moving. Then she opened the next letter in her correspondence stack. She had work to do. That evening, after dinner, a meal that had become, without either of them announcing this change, something shared and unhurried and occasionally genuinely conversational, Caspian asked her to walk with him. She put on her cloak. They went out into the December dark with a lamp, across the gravel and around the east wing to the walled garden gate. The cold was absolute, the air clean and sharp in her lungs, the sky above the moor thick with stars. Inside the garden walls, the lamp cast a small warm circle. He led her to the east wall where the maiden's blush roses were cut back to their winter bones, bare stems, dark thorns, nothing visible that spoke of what they were. He looked at them for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what they'll look like in summer." She looked at the bare stems in the lamplight. "Pale pink," she said. "Almost white at the center. The scent is extraordinary. It fills the whole garden and drifts toward the house on warm evenings." He was quiet. "My mother's favorite variety," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he looked at her, really looked, with the full weight of the clarity that had come to him the night before, and said, "I think she would have liked you." The words were quiet. She held them carefully. "I think," she said, "I would have liked her." They stood in the cold garden together, the lamp between them, the stars above the moor, the bare roses at the wall waiting patiently for everything that was to come. He offered his arm. She took it. and they walked slowly back toward the house, which was lit from within and warm and entirely, completely, unbreakably hers. Spring came back to Ashenmore the following April with the particular joy of something that has been earned. The moor greened from its roots up, gorse and heather and new grass pushing through the dark winter earth with the unstoppable confidence of things that have done this before and know they will do it again. The walled garden woke slowly. Isolde was there in the first week of April, on her knees in the cold mud with her gloves on and Tam beside her, as she had been the previous year. But this year something was different. Caspian came to the garden gate on the third morning and did not stand at the threshold. He came in. He did not say anything grandiose or explanatory about it. He simply came through the gate, rolled up his sleeves, she noticed, with a precision she would never confess to, that he had very capable hands, and said, "Tell me what to do." She looked at him. He met her gaze steadily. "The climbing roses on the east wall," she said. "They need the new ties put on before they start to grow. You'll need the twine." He found the twine. He worked beside her for 2 hours in the spring cold, methodical and competent in asking questions when he needed to, which was more often than she had expected and fewer times than he had feared. They worked in easy intervals of talk and quiet, and the garden moved around them, bird calls over the stone wall, the smell of turned earth, light shifting across the limestone face of the house. When they finished the east wall, she looked at it, the strong old stems and the new soft ties, everything prepared and patient, and felt something she had no word for but recognized entirely. It was enough. All of it. It was enough. Her father came to Ashenmore in May. He traveled by slow stages in a well-sprung carriage that Caspian had arranged without being asked. She had mentioned, once, in passing, that the Suffolk roads were hard on her father's lungs, and the carriage had been dispatched without comment 3 days later. Baron Ravenswood arrived looking thinner than she had hoped and stronger than she had feared, with the particular quality of a man who has been worrying about his daughter for a long time and is now, for the first time, uncertain whether his worry was warranted. He looked at Isolde in the entrance hall of Ashenmore. Her composure, the ease with which she moved through the house, the way the staff turned naturally toward her, and his face did something complicated. She saw the guilt in it. She also saw, beside the guilt, something else, relief. She took his arm and walked him through the house slowly, showing him the rooms, the improvements, the restored tapestry, the morning room she had made her own. She saved the garden for last. They went in through the gate on a warm afternoon, and the maiden's blush roses were in full bloom for the first time. She had not been certain, until 3 days ago, whether they would manage it in only their second season. They had managed it entirely. The pale pink blooms covered the east wall in a cascade so extravagant it looked almost theatrical, and the scent was, as she had told Caspian in December, extraordinary. Her father stopped at the sight of it. His eyes filled. He stood very still, and she stood beside him, and neither of them spoke. Sometimes the thing that needs to be said is already visible. Caspian met Baron Ravenswood at dinner that evening. It was, Isolde observed from her end of the table, one of the more interesting social performances she had witnessed in a year of interesting social performances. Caspian was courteous in the precise, unhurried way that was now beginning to carry warmth. She could feel the difference, even when others could not yet identify it. Her father was gracious and slightly nervous and managed both with the dignity of a man who understands he owes something and is not sure of the right way to acknowledge it. They talked about land management, about the Derbyshire drainage systems, about the particulars of running an estate in clay soil versus chalk. They were, she realized, two people who understood the same fundamental things about responsibility for land and for the people on it, even if one had discharged that responsibility better than the other. After dinner, while Isolde was in the drawing room with her tea, she heard their voices in the study, not the words, but the register, low, measured, the sound of men talking carefully about something important. They were in there for an hour. When they came out, her father's eyes were red-rimmed. Caspian's face was controlled but softer than usual. Neither of them told her what had been said. She did not ask. She understood that there are conversations between people about the damage they have done to each other that belong only to them, and that the outcome, whatever it was visible in the fact that both men could sit in the same drawing room afterward and drink brandy in reasonable quiet. The summer moved through its long days with a fullness that Isolde had not expected and did not take for granted. She knew, with the precision that had always governed her, that what had been built between her and Caspian was real, more real than the contract that had started it, more durable than the crisis that had tested it, but that it required continuing effort and continuing honesty to stay real. She did not confuse the resolution of the worst of their history with the completion of the work of knowing each other. They were still learning. Some evenings they disagreed sharply about estate management, about how to respond to a particular letter from the county magistrate, about the correct approach to a tenant dispute in the North Field. She did not soften her positions. He did not dismiss hers. They argued with the productive rigor of two people who respected each other's intelligence and knew the other could handle the full weight of an honest disagreement. Afterward, always afterward, there was something better. The ease of having been direct and found that directness survived. In July, she rode with him across the full estate boundary, 6 hours in the saddle, the moor enormous and wind-loud around them. He showed her sections of the land he had not shown anyone before. A high field with a view across 3 valleys, a stretch of old woodland near the estate's eastern edge, a ruined shepherd's hut on the ridge whose stone walls were so old no one could say who had built it. He told her things as they rode, stories of the land, of the history in the stone. She listened and asked questions and stored everything the way she always had. But now there was nowhere she needed to store it except in the life she was actually living. In October, on the anniversary of the day Caspian had first appeared at Ravenswood Estate with his contract and his gray eyes and his offer that was designed to be impossible to refuse, they walked in the walled garden together after supper. The roses had been cut back again, the season over, the plants preparing for their winter rest. The evening was cool and amber and smelled of the last chrysanthemums that Tam had planted in the beds nearest the house. They walked without hurry along the east wall, and she thought of the morning a year ago when she had stood at the gate of this garden for the first time and felt, beneath the fear and the practicality and the steady resolve, a longing so deep she had not let herself name it. A longing not for safety, not for comfort, she had never expected either, but for something worth doing. For a life that asked something real of her and gave something real back. She had not told Caspian this. She told him now. They had stopped near the Maiden's Blush, bare-stemmed in the October chill. He stood very still and listened to all of it, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I spent 6 years being angry about your father's choices. 6 years using that anger as a reason to keep people at a distance. 6 years confusing control with strength." He looked at her. "And then I married you to punish a bloodline," he said. "And instead I punished myself for 6 more months by refusing to see what was directly in front of me." She looked at him. "What was directly in front of you?" she asked. "The person," he said simply, "who was going to make everything I had built worth building." She held those words the way she held the best of what she had found in this place. Carefully, completely, without looking away. The following February, 1 year to the month from the night she had sat at her dressing table in the newly arrived Duchess's rooms and written to her father to say she was not broken, Isolde stood at the east window of the morning room in the morning's first light and watched snow settle on the walled garden. It came quietly, the way the best things came, without announcement, without drama, covering everything with a clean and equal whiteness that made the familiar strange and the bare beautiful. She had a cup of tea. She had a letter to her father half-written on the desk behind her. She wrote every Thursday, rain or shine, scandal or peace. She had the deep knowledge, somewhere in the steadiest part of herself, that she was where she was supposed to be. Not because the world had arranged itself conveniently, not because everything had become easy. Because she had made it, choice by choice, morning by morning, document by document, rose by rose. Behind her, she heard footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, distinctive, belonging to no one else. The door opened. She did not turn. She heard him come in, heard the familiar sounds of his morning routine, cup set on the desk, chair pulled out, papers opened, and then quiet. She looked out at the snow settling on the garden. He came to stand beside her at the window. He did not speak. He did not need to. They stood together in the winter morning light and looked at the garden she had brought back from ruin, and the snow fell on the maiden's blush rose stems, bare and stubborn and alive, and outside the window's ashen moor was white and enormous and entirely, unmistakably home. This is what it meant to stay, not the absence of pain, not the resolution of every wound, not the clean ending that the world tells you deserve if you suffer enough. It meant this: a February morning with snow and tea and a man standing beside you who has learned, slowly and with difficulty, to be worthy of the woman who refused to break. It meant the roses that had no reason to grow and grew anyway. It meant 47 people in a house that knew your name. It meant a father in Suffolk who slept better knowing you were all right. It meant the morning room and the estate office and the walled garden and the long rides across the moor and the evenings by the fire and the arguments that ended in clarity and the silences that held comfort instead of weaponry. It meant the moment you stopped performing endurance and started simply living. Isolde turned from the window. She went to her desk. She picked up her pen. She looked at the half-written letter to her father, and she thought about what to add. Then she wrote, "The roses will come back in spring, father. They always do. I have learned that about them. I have learned that about myself. The things that are built properly, the things that are planted in good faith in cold ground and tended with patience, they come back. They come back stronger than they were before." She set down the pen. Outside, the snow was still falling. Inside, the fire was lit. Caspian was reading at his desk, and the house was warm and full of the quiet industry of 47 people who knew what they were part of, and it was, in every way that mattered, in every way she had worked for and stayed for and refused to relinquish, entirely, completely, permanently hers.